Welcome back. This is the Colombia Calling podcast. I am your host, Richard McColl, currently in London, England. I'm on my summer holidays in London, soon to come to an end, and I'll be back in the blitz of Bogota. But it's a great episode this week. Everyone should tune into this one because we are looking ahead at the elections, a big election year in front of us, before us in Colombia. That's right, 2026. We'll have the first round and the second round of elections, and everything is to play for right now. And it seems to me that we should be speaking to our friends at Colombia Risk Analysis. Of course, we've got the director, Sergio Guzmán, in Bogota, and Izzy Hawes, who was an intern there, but is doing her second master's, and she's now at Georgetown University studying government and conflict resolution there. But she's from the UK, and you'll hear her accent. So both of you, welcome back. Sergio, you don't need any welcoming. Everybody knows you. But Izzy, welcome on the Colombia Calling podcast.
Thank you so much. It's really great to be here.
It's an absolute pleasure. It's an absolute pleasure that I'm north of the river, you're south of the river, and Sergio's in Bogota, isn't it? The mind boggles. Now, you guys, you've put together a very complete multi-page report about the upcoming elections, fragmentation and polarization 1 year ahead of the next presidency. I was kind of left speechless at how in-depth this went. I've read it twice, so first and foremost, let me just say to everyone out there, read it. Just go to colombiariskanalysis.com and then you'll find the reports on there, elsewhere. How many months, you guys, had you been working on this? Because this is not an overnight job.
So I was in Bogota, in Colombia, for 2 months this summer. We sort of started talking about it a couple of weeks beforehand. So just under 3 months, I'd say.
So 3 months is a good amount of time. I imagine this was the key project that you were working on. Sergio's very good like that, especially for interns. He gives them a good, chunky or meaty project to work on. So you've got something, to take away with you, I think is very cool. What did you find, Izzy, as the most challenging part of this project?
Oh, that's a good question. I'd say it comes out a year ahead of the next presidency. So at this point, things are still very uncertain. So when speaking to various interviewees, getting clear responses, pretty hard at this point.
Definitely hard to get. But there is no real clarity to begin with here. Sergio, how are you feeling as an analyst? Colombia Risk Analysis work must be on the uptick right now for this investment fears from international companies, or at the very least queries. Some months ago, before a number of events, and we'll get into those took place, some months ago, we could have suggested that the election would swing right. But how are you feeling right now, Sergio, regarding this?
I think there's a lot of anxiety amongst Colombians, but also amongst foreigners that follow Colombians and have investments here. That partly reflects how fed up people are with the current status quo, the current administration, the way Petro is taking the country. Many people just want to get it over. They want this narrative that says Petro's a lame duck, he can't do much. We're going to have a right-wing government in 2026, so hunker down and just let's wait to time pass. Fortunately, none of that is true. There's still a year left to go. There's still a lot of things that Petro can do in the meantime. He is still president, and the election, for what it's worth, is still wide open. So a lot of people want a definitive answer. Tell me somebody on the right is going to win. Somebody is going to be sensitive and sensible. And a lot of people are saying, promise me there's going to be no continuity to Petro. We can't guarantee those things at this point of the election. What we can try to explain to people and clients specifically is the process that leads us through the election. And right now, the incentives aren't there for candidates to, rule out their candidacy and adhere to somebody else. The incentives aren't there for people to pick winning sides either. and determine, I'm going to run for Congress, or I'm going to run for the Bogota mayoralty down the line, etc. And the incentive for President Petro to sort of like become a lame duck, or like at least look into the final days of his presidency with some sort of nostalgia of, I did this much, or I did this much, this is my legacy, etc. That's not there. What I tell people often is, don't think of Petro as this guy who's writing his memoirs on the beachside, looking into the sunset and reminiscing on the good old days. Think of Petro as the guy who's charging at the firing squad, right? This is a person who is very much intent on fighting lost battles, on making a point of things. And so until August 6th, 2026, Petro is going to have us, to the edge of our seats. For business, I'm not sure if that's good, frankly, because I think a lot of people are also waiting for this administration to be over before making investment decisions. But I think that this report, which is free access, and we think a contribution to knowledge and a contribution to the thought environment in Colombia, aims to open people's eyes to what's to come, to the main challenges that the country is grappling with, and who the potential candidates are to succeed.
There tends to be this feeling, and there's justified sides to it and unjustified sides to it, which are both put into the report. But there tends to be this feeling that everything is going poorly in Colombia. I mean, and let's be entirely honest, as someone who studies media and the newspapers, and there is a campaign to ensure that everything on the front page is negative about Petro. Now, it's easy to be very negative about him. Let's get that out there right away. But it does seem like a campaign. So, Izzy, on this one, how do you, when coming into this project, how familiar were you with what's going on in Colombia? Because you're studying international, let's say, conflict resolution. We have conflict, whichever way you want to look at it, in Venezuela. We have conflict in Colombia. There's conflict in Ecuador. Bolivia's got elections coming up next year. Peru has what's it? I think Boluarte is at 1% approval rating. The region isn't particularly stable. So did you come into it looking up from the balcony down and saying, listen, it's not just Colombia, it's the whole region that's a bit in turmoil?
Yeah, I mean, that's a very good description of the region. I mean, perhaps I could even hazard of the world at the moment. Yeah, there's an awareness of the region, obviously, and also the report will go into a little of foreign relations and how Colombia is sitting with its foreign relations. For sure. I mean, in terms of Pedro, how he's seen in the news, he's quite a divisive figure, let's say, very polarizing. And that we're expecting to see this continued polarization for the remainder of the electoral race and even into the next government. Whoever wins, whatever the outcome of the election, it will continue to be a divisive, and we'll see some inflammatory rhetoric.
Yeah,
as we keep going.
Most definitely. There's no doubt about that. It's the rhetoric will build. It will increase. I'm always fascinated by again, on the first page, you've got the table of the presidential candidates. I'm always fascinated by these. And there's the usual names, obviously, Gustavo Bolívar on the left, Roy Barreras, who we know has been mobilizing for a while, Daniel Quintero, former mayor of Bogota, Maria Jose Pizarro, Luis Gilberto Murillo, again, all on the left. Center, Sergio Fajardo, it seems like the permanent candidate. Claudia Lopez, former mayor of Bogota, and Maurice Armitage. And then you've got on the right, Victoria Davila, the Semana journalist, Maria Fernanda Cabal, eternal right-wing candidate, and Germán Vargas Lleras. But we know that, we're pretty sure that Germán Vargas Lleras, forgive me for saying, probably won't run due to health issues. Maria Fernanda Cabal, when she stops sort of being overzealous, can be actually very clear. in her campaigning. That's not to say I'm saying pro or contra, but she can be very clear. And I know people who have been, convinced by her. Vicky Davila, of course, has the, the megaphone of Semana. But it's still, when you look at all these candidates, it's still all up for grabs. Now, with Vicky Davila, she's leading, the informal polls right now. Is that right?
Yes.
Yeah.
You also see Miguel Uribe, who's also cited in the polls.
Yeah.
But otherwise, yes, she's leading.
Miguel Uribe, well, perhaps we should talk about that. We have done an explainer episode about that on June 7th, I think, if I'm not mistaken, or June 7th, around there. Miguel Uribe was, there was an assassination attempt on his life, very nearly succeeded. He was a pre-candidate for the presidential nomination for the conservative, the right of center, right of center, Centro Democrático Uribista party, very much a figure on social media, 39 years old, seen as an up-and-coming, promising politician for that side of things. He was shot several times by a 15-year-old assassin, but of course this is a multi-layered assassination attempt. We're not going to go into that. It wasn't the kid pulled the trigger, but where does the intellectual author go back to? But he's still in hospital. I believe he may have opened his eyes in a recent week or so. How he can be an actual leading figure in an opinion poll is well, it's a sympathy vote. Surely, it's at the moment. People are an outpouring of support for him. He's not really going to win the elections, is he, or Sergio?
No, but I think it also shows the importance that security will play in the electoral race as it goes forward. And this is also something we expect that the right wing will play into, this fear of violence, fear of return to a period of political violence that saw in decades past. So it really helps their narrative, and it helps criticism of the current government.
It's true. I mean, I think you've got several things in them, and I'll ask Sergio in a minute just to list off the several points, the key points there in the report. For me, security will be the one where it's played out. For me, security, because then it ties into everything. It ties into investment, and it ties into rural control, and it ties into the trafficking, and so on and so forth, and of course all of the different things. But Sergio, I know you want to jump in now.
The thing is that in Colombia, security has usually been like the central decider of people's decision to vote, right? Peace or war has always been sort of like our dichotomy. In Argentina, it's inflation, right? And the economy, and that's the most important part. I argue that although, insecurity is still a very significant part, Petro has made those interests less central. Partly because he's done these very astute ceasefire agreements with all these organized armed criminal organizations. There's currently negotiations, but nothing's happening, and nothing is going to happen while the negotiations end. What has been surfacing much more is corruption, healthcare, and everything to do with how people feel about the economy, jobs. And so in a way, in a security-based election, right? Like this is 100% about security, Petro loses. But Petro has arguably, made this election about many different things, where he has a mixed record and where the country is very pessimistic about the direction of the country, which does not bode well for him. But I think that this is also one of the things that makes this election so difficult to understand.
Yeah, and if we take into account, obviously, the most recent impacting situation as the sentencing of former president 2002 to 2010, Álvaro Uribe Vélez, 12 years of house arrest and a pretty substantial fine for, I guess it's sort of judicial fraud in its way, as you call it, or coercion of witnesses in the court case. a court case of his own making, because he it flipped back on him for an accusation he had against Cepeda, the left-wing senator, but not about that. But this has also thrown a bit of the spanner in the works, because he is the central unifying glue for the right. And to see that now, you're always going to have the people who support the right. But just as Petro, he knows he's always got 33 or 34%. Doesn't matter what he does. So you've got these two sides facing off, which makes it incredibly difficult to say anything. But it's that middle floating voter, which makes me think of like the period of when John Major called for that back in England, when he won against the odds against Neil Kinnock. Now, Izzy's laughing because she's probably studied that, but she's too young to remember it. I'm old enough to remember it. But it makes me think of that. Can we say that the battle is for the middle ground?
In a way, it's always been for the middle ground. But the thing is that if you think about it, Uribe is no longer the kingmaker on the right he used to be. Now he has to negotiate with Cambio Radical, with the Conservative Party, with even the Abelardo de la Espriella and Santiago Botero factions and the Vicky Dávila factions that are even, they're not formally affiliated with the party. And although Petro is the kingmaker for the Pacto Histórico, he still needs the Roy Barreras and all these people to join in. Neither of those groups gets you to 51% of the electorate. So you need, those centrist voters who a lot of people happily say they don't exist, right? The center doesn't exist. They're very happy to say it. I make a strong case for the center because that's where I politically identify. I exist. But at the same time, it's a very difficult to narrow down position, because in the center you have Sergio Fajardo, who's made zero alliances with absolutely anybody and still renounces doing that. That's not going to get him to 51%. You have Claudia Lopez, who has said she won't refuse the support of Petro if the day comes. But then she's also said, you have to spray bullets as much as you can to a bunch of people that are criminals. So is she centrist with that sort of rhetoric? It's very difficult to pin down the center, and I would attribute that also to a very lack of cohesive political parties here that align people based on their political interests and not necessarily based on following a charismatic person or following specific monetary interests associated with regional politics. So I think that that's a huge flaw in our policy. 39 political parties is not viable for a democracy to handle. That's my, I'll get off my soapbox on that now.
I like soapboxes. Go all on it. I pointed out Speaker's Corner the other day, so I like the soapboxes. But it just seems to me, again, from a perspective, if I was thinking of student politics, I love the idea of non-compromising Sergio Fajardo. I love the idea of not compromising, kind of being revolutionary in that, but again, as you say, it won't get him anywhere, and we've already been disappointed by him in that. And I remember when my wife voted for Humberto de la Calle all those years ago, and I remember looking at it, I said, I think you should be more strategic with that vote. I mean, we can say great to Humberto de la Calle, nice, very inoffensive person to elect in this situation. But I think you should be more strategic. And she was like, no, I'm doing this. I said, all right. Well, that was one vote. But if more people could have thought like that, maybe Sergio Fajardo could have been. But I think there's so much baggage on both sides. And I just want to, let's clear up some things about Vicky Dávila, because she does seem to take the headlines. She's very good at that. She's been traveling the country. She gets a lot of airtime, of course, given her things. Now, in your report, you said that Vicky Dávila is siding up to, is it Alicia Arango for vice president? Is that right?
Alicia Arango is currently campaign advisor, political strategist for Vicky Dávila.
Okay. So this is a character who is the most Uribista of the Uribistas, really, within actual parties. She was she personal secretary for a while to Uribe. She was one of his, she had his ear when she was coming up through the ranks from Valledupar. She's been minister in various things. Under Duque, she was a minister, wasn't she? She had a cabinet thing, and then she was
Labor
often,
minister,
yeah, wasn't she off in Switzerland as the ambassador there for a while? I don't know. She got a nice gig after that, but this would be, as you suggested as well in the report, Vicky Davila siding up to the Uribistas, and of course, Vicky Davila paints herself very much as an outsider, against the grain, which, can we just say, quite openly, she's not an outsider. She may not. She may not belong to a party that we would consider being part of the establishment, but she's not an outsider at all. I mean, how did you deal with this, Izzy?
Well, I think it's when considering her alliances, she characterizes herself as an independent. She refuses to characterize her ideology, instead presenting herself as a candidate of the people. But when we're analyzing this, there is a degree of ideological alignment with the Democratic Center, especially with Alicia Arango and also Sandra Suarez on her team. So I think there's a chance, if she maintains her position, that she could be a broad front candidate from the right in an inter-party referendum, but also that could jeopardize her independence, which I put in air quotes.
Yeah, I saw that. I saw it. That's all the quotes. And so I find, again, a very interesting. If we go back again, that's the Maria Fernanda Cabal obviously has taken, I would say, the noise for the rest of the right. Paloma Valencia and others have withdrawn or suspended their campaigns after the assassination attempt on Miguel Uribe, like in solidarity. Do we feel it really was in solidarity for someone like Paloma Valencia? Because she's always been jostling in the wings. I kind of feel that she hadn't got the sort of impetus to continue, and it was, I hate to say it, there's a sort of convenience of suspension of her candidacy. I don't know how you feel on that, either one of you.
No, I think, a lot of people in this Democratic Center are confused because their leader is imprisoned. One of their lead candidates is in a hospital bed. And I feel like they don't want to make this decision without plurality of their constituents sort of like being aware. The problem is that they need to move forward, and they need to move forward fast because they can't fragment their own electorate who is going to want to vote for a strong candidate to substitute Petro. So Vicky is very keen on sort of vacuuming in all those votes and saying, I represent Uribismo, and I represent the right and the disgruntled right and the business class and whatnot. So Vicky, what she lacks in political experience of management, she has in sort of like this acumen of communications. And so in that way, Vicky is quite an astute candidate, and a good-looking candidate too, because voters vote for that kind of thing as well. But there's just a haze going in the Democratic Center right now that they ought to get out of quick if they want to win. But one of the things that we've discussed in previous reports, Richard, is if the right wants to win, being anti-Petrista is not going to be enough. Only being against the status quo isn't going to be enough, because Petro was legitimately elected because of how people felt inequality was very bad, how people felt that the government did not pay attention to the needs of the poorest, how the government looked at the downtrodden and said, may they eat cake. And I don't think that that's necessarily something that the right is very keen on addressing at this point. All they want to do is talk about how bad Petro is, how bad he's for business, how bad he's for security, how bad he's for healthcare, without necessarily offering any sort of mea culpa about who got us Petro in the first place.
Yeah, now it's no secret where I stand regarding the previous president, and he is I would say, almost in his entirety. He holds a huge amount of responsibility for Petro coming in. I personally feel that Petro came 4 years too late. I think if he'd come in after Santos, it would have been. I think there would obviously be all sorts of issues because Petro, we know, is a dreadful manager and doesn't know how to delegate and everything else. But I think with the full coffers for peace and so on, and the degree of, I would have said, the degree of people were looking forward to potential sort of what's going to come of the peace accord. There was positivity around it. I think Petro could have come in then rather than the gentleman who decided that he wanted to tear up, as he said, the peace accord. Of course, he couldn't because it's written into the constitution, but it's nice to say it from a tarima or a stage and what have you. Yes, the needs of the most needy were ignored, and hence, of course, COVID. But 2019 and 2021 have fed very much the demonstrations into Petro's camp. So, as you were right, and I've said this. If I've not said this, I've said this a dozen times on here, is the Duque administration was entirely unaware of the psychological transition that took place in Colombia in that period with 2016. They were entirely unaware that lifting, let's say, which was the single most important bugbear and hate figure of the FARC as it was, lifting that out of the equation. Of course, we know it's not fully out of the equation, but at this moment in time, lifting it out of the equation meant people were actually concerned about other things. And let's say cost of living, shark fin hunting, deforestation. You saw them all out there. It's the truth of it. And so that leads into where we are today. Of course it is. So again, saying that Petro is bad is not a completely successful campaign policy or manifesto. We have to mention one of the spoilers, and I think you know where I'm going with this. She turns up every election year and makes some sort of agreement with someone and then usually ends up sinking them. Obviously, it's not her alone, but there's always some sort of conflict, whether it's academic, intellectual, political, whatever. Ingrid Betancourt. Now, I am not criticizing her for, I behoove anyone to try and survive what she went through. And, obviously, we have to lament and curse the FARC. We have to lament her situation and that of Clara Rojas, and curse a situation that put her into shackles for 6 years in the jungle. But she is still a political actor, and she turns up about 6 months before any election and, makes alliances. And then it's almost like a meme now. They're like, okay, who's she going to sing? So you've got her here in your center column in a yellow box, and the yellow box I see here is seeking recognition to run for Congress. Is that what we see, Izzy? Is she going to turn up again soon? Has she turned up? I haven't been following.
I'll actually turn to Sergio for this one. He knows best on Ingrid.
I think Ingrid's like a shark,
Yeah.
She can smell blood in the water and she's gonna go for it, for the jugular. I think she's waiting for the right and opportune moment to turn out. And I think a lot of people are, be mindful. One of the things that we talk to clients about, because they want to, narrow this down to 8. And we sort of narrowed it down to 9 in the report because that's what people want. But at this point in time, it's 75 candidates. You're not going to do 75 candidate profiles. You're not going to spend that money and do all those interviews. You need more manageable options, right? But the process filters out, right? And there is a process. People just want this sort of to peter out immediately and for us to have debates amongst 4 candidates right now. That's not going to happen. 75 candidates until 3 key dates. End of October, which is when we have the intra-party primaries. Early December, December 8th, when we have the congressional party list. So all those people who want to run for Congress are going to drop out of the presidential race. and make,
Mm.
an announcement. And then March 8th, which is the congressional elections and the intra-party primaries. That will bring us down from 75 candidacies to approximately 9 or 8. So between now and then, and mind you, there's not going to be any polling until November. So we're
This is a new
basically,
law, right? This
this
is
is
a
a
new
new
law.
law.
Yeah.
Petro signed a bill, and it was endorsed by political parties across the line. It wasn't a controversial law for them, but for the public, it is very controversial because we have less information, right? So we're sort of driving blind, right? Until early November, and then all of a sudden we're gonna have this like boom, 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 boom period, and we'll have it, right? Uh, so follow along if you want to know more about what happens. But one of the things that
Sorry.
gives a lot of power to people like Ingrid Betancourt is like these announcements that, if she gathers 2% of the voting intention or whatever, she brings somebody over the edge, right?
Mm.
So these people have an enormous power to say, and Ingrid Betancourt did this in the last election, by the way. I'm sort of like the glue that sticks you together, but you have to put my niece as the head of the party list for Bogota. So it's not just, individual ambitions, it's an ambition to create a web of clientelism that
Mm.
happens. And so you're gonna see, a guy like Mauricio Liscano, he knows he doesn't have a chance, right? But he needs to campaign left and right to get all the members of the U Party a fair
Mm.
shot of winning in key elections where he's going to have 6 or 7 senators or 3 or 4 members of Congress. And when it comes the moment for the next president to pass anything, you know who they're going to have to talk to? To Mauricio Liscano, because he has those votes. And so that's a way that this is why, just reading it as who wins, who doesn't, what party wins, what doesn't, it doesn't make sense. We need to understand who the people are, what their relationship is to the names that they're putting forward, and how this is going to impact policy making and governance in the next 4 years.
But we don't seem to look at these actual things. It's so character driven. The elections. It's where. Forgive me for looking, but if I look at the UK elections, I look at what the party policy is, and I look through all these things, and I don't overly look at the party leader as much. I mean, I know I'm in the minority probably of this, but I look at the party as a whole. Whereas here in Colombia, everyone points at the president. Everyone points at the president being the one who's going to resolve everything. But of course, where things get done is Congress. We need to look at that a bit. I want to go in a bit more about previous elections. And I think one of the things you brought up in the report, which I like, is that at this point in time, people who are leading in the polls, in this point in time, the equivalent point in time in the last elections, did not come to the final, to the second round. We're not in the second round. So for us to say that Gustavo Bolivar on the left, Sergio Fajardo in the center, and Vicky Davila on the right, there's a possibility that they might not make that second round.
Yeah, I mean, especially with a particularly polarized election. So the polls have previously sort of failed to predict voting intentions, as we've seen. I also want to highlight 2022 with Rodolfo Hernandez, and also even with the peace referendum in 2016. The polls don't accurately show who Colombians would like to vote for, what they'd like to vote for. It's possible that the candidate will not be on the stage in the polls for until 5 to 6 months before. Also, we saw this with Duque in 2018.
That's right. He was in third or fourth place so we were like, who's this guy? But it's all very, very interesting. And then there's those people who vote, obviously looking at the candidacies and so on. And then in more impoverished regions where it's vote buying. I've seen this with my own eyes. I know people who've done it. A lot of the team I employ in the coastal city of Monpós. I know. They tell me outright. They'll just vote for who, and depending on what kind of contracts are coming up, for the town and what have you. It's who pays the most. So it's always a concern at this point. I have further queries here, and we need to. It's that point of this conversation. We need to discuss the United States, because obviously you do have a big section on there, and international relationships, international relations, and so on. Of course, Petro really sees himself as the brother in arms to Lula in Brazil, but it's a different situation, and Lula has an entirely different standing internationally than Petro does. And he has an entirely different war chest, let's say, in terms of investment and what he can offer the world than Petro. And then, of course, Petro sees himself as very close to Boric, but of course, it looks like the right will be getting in there in Chile as well. So we're seeing all sorts of changes. And I noticed today, if I didn't read wrong, that a lot of the indigenous support and the socialists are moving away from MAS, the original party there for Morales and so on. So there's this kind of movement, and the US obviously is very much involved in policy making and policy thinking, and with someone as predictably unpredictable as Donald Trump in office, and then do I want to say his lackey, or I'll get in trouble, Marco Rubio, pandering to the Republicans and Republican base in Florida. Sergio, jump in and tell us where the US fits into all of this.
I think the US is going to be very vocal about who they do not support in the Colombian election.
I think we know what's clear there.
It's less clear that they'll sort of weigh in on the election, although President Trump is likely to send some tweet. But Colombia is not at the top of his list.
No.
Good for us, right? We're not the main priority of the US. But his name will sort of become a thing, because I think undoubtedly Colombians disapprove of Donald Trump. And that disapproval of Trump has been proxied by disapproval of the United States, a country that is our main trading partner, a country where Colombians have very deep cultural ties, value affinity to, that are inextricably linked. Petro wants to delink Colombia from the United States. And in doing so, he's tried to make Colombia closer to the BRICS. He's tried to make Colombia join the BRICS Bank. He's joined the Belt and Road Initiative. He has attempted to diversify Colombia's international relationships, as you put it, Richard. However, the weaving of international relationships is not done with a stroke of a pen. It is something that has that very person-to-person, business-to-business ties, a trust-based component, a sharing-based component that you build over time. And so you can't just unplug us from the United States and plug us into China, because that's the way the world is going. You actually have to build that up. And although Petro is trying to unplug us, plugging us back in is not going to be easier. And so in a way, I don't necessarily think that Petro's effort to diversify is wrong, but the way he's doing it is shattering our credibility. Is making it more difficult for Colombians to be taken seriously. Is making it more difficult for the next administration to do something. That the problem is, because we're in a global cultural media landscape, a lot of candidates, particularly on the right, are taking pro-Trumpian stances. And that's not going to get them very far. Maria Fernanda Cabal wears the Make America Great Again hat. So did Miguel Uribe, by the way, who went to CPAC on a number of occasions.
Yeah.
Right? And so if they want to proxy themselves as pro-Trump leaders, that's not necessarily going to bode well for them with a Colombian electorate. And so that's what I'm saying. The shadow of the U.S. is going to loom over this election. Maybe we don't know how deeply, because we're not necessarily at the point where there is consequences for Petro's dislike of the US and dislike of Trump. But evidently that will happen.
The decoupling, let's say, of the US is something. It shouldn't happen to the extent, but then does need, as you say as well, diversification is not a bad thing. It's not a bad thing, but a decoupling takes a lot of time. And, we are so intrinsically linked that it's, again, like you say, it's not with the sweep of a pen. But we're not the top of Donald Trump's list, but we do rise to the top every now and then. We rose to the top with the online spat that turned into an international spat about the return of illegal migrants back to Colombia from the United States, and Petro obviously criticized their return as they were being shackled and so on. And then we rose to the top for a little bit, and then we went down the list again, the league table. We'll be back up on the top again when they talk about decertification, which, given the current administration in the United States, is a real possibility. And you've said that in the report as well, the decertification, because we're not pulling our weight, basically, in the, I hasten to say, not war on drugs, but the counter-narcotics effort, I think is probably more politically correct here. How do you see this unfolding there, Sergio?
Well, I do think that decertification is a fait accompli. It is going to happen in September. And that's going to mean not necessarily an automatical withdrawal of U.S. assistance to Colombia, but it makes all of U.S. assistance to Colombia discretionary. So that means it will hinge upon the lobbying prowess of Colombian legislators, of the Colombian military, and of the Colombian government to see how it's done. Essentially, the U.S. is going to call us to kiss the ring. Now, you and I both know what Petro's reaction is going to be to that. And so, in that sense, it's the U.S. is not going to be like, oh, I'm casting us out. It's more like, come kiss the ring, and then we'll see. All of that, and it's poignant that you mentioned Brazil, because Lula this week he had an interview where he said, I'm not going to humiliate myself into going to the U.S. And asking Trump to improve the conditions for Brazil. Petro's going to take the exact same stance, much to the chagrin of Colombia, because what's at stake here is not the honor, is whether helicopters have enough gasoline to fly, is whether we are able to pay the pensions of the military members, which Petro, by the way, has increased, right? Mm-hmm. It's whether assistance gets to places like Chocó and Guaviare and Putumayo, where U.S. food assistance has been vital to that. Mm-hmm. Is whether migrants making the trek from Cucuta to the Darien Gap get fed on the way, fed and housed, because a lot of the U.S. assistance fed for places that gave migrants some sort of comfort and solace so that they could, apply legally for asylum while in Colombia. And so in that sense, the U.S. is shooting itself in the foot, but Petro's also shooting itself in the foot. Nobody is necessarily interested in being the adult in the room that is in a decision-making position. The diplomats, they're all in a frenzy, right? They all want this relationship to work out, to be well, but they're not ultimately the deciders.
Yeah, as you say, there aren't adults in the room. So moving on from the US, because I think we could take up hours and hours on this. But moving on to the US, back to Colombia a bit. We've talked about, again, the different things that people the candidates will need to aim for. But Izzy, in your in-depth studies of all of this topic and the months that you were in Colombia and so on, what was the item when you were investigating that most sort of knocked you back and said, really? Really, this is in Colombia? This is something I need to look into? Or the thing that was the strangest for you when you think about the political machinations in Colombia?
Well, that's a tough question.
It's my secret question. It was
Secret
my
question.
surprise question.
The secret machinations. I mean, I think something that I want to highlight that will be super important. I don't know whether it's secret, but it's something that came time and time again, was how hard it's going to be to build coalitions and how necessary that will be with the fragmentation that we're seeing in Congress and how many independent movements have been set up. I mean, building a majority in Congress is going to be really hard. And without a majority, it's going to be really hard to govern and pass all of the reforms and the legislation that everyone wants to see. And people are going to have to compromise on their positions. They're going to have to compromise on their ideological positions. That will lose them support. So depending on the outcome of the next election, how big the majority is, I think that's going to be a really defining feature.
Oh, okay. I'll say that you answered the question there, but that's okay. It was a trick. It was a trick one that I spun out there. It was a hard one. But so what? I mean, at the end of it, when you sort of weigh it all up, there's a fear, well, at least the opposition to the government at the moment are sowing seeds for fear, that saying that Petro might not want to give up power, and it might want to try and extend illegally his mandate. What are your thoughts on that?
I think it's a possibility, but I mean, obviously, it depends on the outcome. In terms of if it's a centrist win, it's possible that sort of center-left leaning candidate Petro might try and sort of claim the victory, or at least co-opt it as part of his success, sort of his continuation of a project. If it's a significantly big right-wing success, then yeah, this alarming rhetoric will continue. These will paint the country as divided, could provoke outcries, social upheaval. And I mean, if the possibility of seeing social mobilization there's a good chance of that.
100% chance there'll be social mobilization. That's what Colombia is all about at the moment. We've had it just as we record this, just yesterday in favor of Alvaro Uribe, the sentenced former president, and Petro is immensely in favor of social mobilization and shouting from the balcony.
But he's going to be the worst ex-president, no?
Well, I don't know.
Worse than Uribe, maybe.
No, I think Duque is the worst because he tries to speak like an older statesman and still doesn't know how to read. Forgive me,
Duque,
I said that.
Duque, I'll give him credit. He's been uninvolved.
What do you mean? He talks all the time.
But nobody listens.
Yes,
Petro
that's the problem.
Is going
Just
to
me.
Be omnipresent. Petro is going to be, in your breakfast table, in your lunch table, and in your dinner table. Like, he's just not going to leave it be.
Because he's that character. It's true. Nobody listens to Duque. Unfortunately, he's like the.
You read his memoirs, didn't you, Richard?
I didn't. I wouldn't. What, you mean that 6-volume thing that I saw in Tornamesa, and I was like, did anyone buy that?
Speeches.
Oh my God! Did anyone buy that? And they said to me in Tornamesa, no one's bought it. So there you go. But I know people have bought it. But at the same time, I just can't with him. He comes up and says things like he's the most noteworthy. That's why he stays in the US all the time now, because they do listen to him. But I think that Colombia's institutions are stronger than to allow Petro to return. And I think actually at the end of it, can we suggest that that he believes in the institutions and the strength of the institutions as well? What do you feel?
I think the institutions are strong in Colombia, and we wrote a report about this in January, which I think is quite important. I don't think that institutions in Colombia are weak. I think they've stood up to Petro as they stood up to Uribe last week when they put him in prison. But institutions aren't necessarily buildings make a brick or mortar. Institutions are people that make decisions that affect other people. So when we talk about institutions, we can't just assume they're buildings and they're there. We have to keep them. We have to make sure to nominate the right people to those institutions. We have to keep them staffed. We have to keep them well paid, and I think that there's this ethos around the world that says, oh, these bureaucrats, they don't do anything. So we need to, cut that bad, and we need to make sure that they're not there. And we're going to find out that how harmful and detrimental that is to our democracy. In a way, Petro has fought and lost against the institutions, and that's not necessarily a bad thing. Obviously, he complains about it quite vividly. But if a Petro-leaning government wins in 2026, they're going to make sure that that doesn't happen to them. And so what they're going to try to do is they're going to attempt to weaken institutions, appointing people that are much more ideologically aligned to them, the central bank, etc. And that is a slow creep towards authoritarianism, right? Venezuela didn't become Venezuela in a day, right? Venezuela became Venezuela over the course of years. Very careful planning, very careful pitching out of people. Not saying that that's going to be Colombia's luck, but as we've said in the report previously, it's still an open race.
Izzy, we'll wind this down now, but give us a little bit of feedback of what it was like to do your work experience with Colombia Risk Analysis, and how you found it there with the taskmaster, who is Sergio Guzmán.
This is a lot of power, but I'll use it rightly. He's an amazing boss, and I think you can tell from how he speaks on here, how he speaks in other podcasts, the amount of intelligence that he has. I can't speak highly enough of Colombia Risk. Okay. Honestly, I can't. I'm not just saying that because I'd love a good reference. I do mean it. I think they're a pretty unique organization. So I encourage everybody to keep on touch with their reports and all of their analysis, especially as the rest of the race carries on. They're putting out more reports as well on the fiscal crisis right now, and there's one coming out on Brazil as well, which were done by my fellow interns. A little shout out for them.
Hang on Brazil?
On Brazil.
I want to read that.
It's coming soon. Look out for it.
I will look out for it. I've always liked to keep up on Brazil. And Sergio, how can people get in touch with you or apply for positions? Because I know that it's highly sought after.
So I'm glad you asked. First, a couple of listeners to this podcast have actually interned with me, which is amazing. So you probably don't know it, but maybe if you're a master's student, your first year going on to your second, on the summer holidays, we do have a window for internships. So I would urge you to apply if you're a master's student, because this is how we are able to feed these reports. This kind of experience is very useful for your master's and hopefully thereafter. Some of our interns are now at the Council of Foreign Relations. Some of our interns are also working at big organizations like Royal Caribbean, some of whom have been on this podcast even. So I think interns who are trying to look in how to make a pivot to international relations, political risk, look at this as an opportunity. But it's important to mention they have to be interested in Colombia deeply, not just perfunctorily or not just tangentially because they're interested in Latin America broadly. We had that luck with Izzy. And as a fellow Brit who's enamored with our country, Richard, you can see one when you can tell one when you see one. And Izzy is definitely one of them. This is not going to be her last time here in Colombia. And it was very special for us to have her. So people that gather these qualities, they're in their master's degree, they're in their summer vacation, they are interested in doing a meaty report, and they love Colombia. This is a place for them.
Very cool, and very easy to fall in love with Colombia once you're here. Not a bad place to spend a couple of months at all, and you are on the, dare I say it, the front line of reporting when you're doing things like this with Colombia Risk Analysis. So let me take this moment to thank you both for your time. Thank you to Izzy Hawes, for a master's student at Georgetown, second master's student at Georgetown. She's south of the river from me right now. And of course, to Director of Colombia Risk Analysis, Sergio Guzmán in Bogotá. So thank you again to both of you. I do urge everyone to take a look at the report, please. Fragmentation and polarization 1 year ahead of the next presidency, because rhetoric will increase, social mobilizations will increase. Recent events in Colombia do hold significant bearing on what might occur next year. Colombia, never dull, as I always say, never at all dull. So thank you both.
Thank you, Richard. Have a
Thank you.
great afternoon.
Thank you again. This has been the Colombia Calling podcast. I have been your host, Richard McColl, here in London, back in Bogota for next episode. And of course, if you wish to support us, go to www.patreon.com/Colombia Calling. And of course, you can support Emily Hart's Colombia briefing on her Substack. Just put Emily Hart into Google Substack and you'll find it there. That's me for this week, and goodbye.